Okay, so we're already recording. For those of you who don't want your face recorded, you have, now is the time to turn your cameras off. But I think that those of us who have our camera on we're cool with it. So I'll get started. You're on mute, and Ambassador, but I'll start with asking the first question. But before I get to that, I'll say thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. We've all really greatly enjoyed reading this book. In preparation for this, I read it like a third time actually, and I learned a lot. But just to start the conversation as a sort of icebreaker, I want to begin by asking you a bit, about yourself. So we know who you are, but we want to hear who you are in your own words. So the book provides an excellent breakdown of Eritrea's history and the series of events that led the country to its present state. However, you don't really write about yourself in the book. So before we get started talking about the book, tell us a little bit about you, your story, your journey, and why you joined the fight for independence, and what led you to writing this book.
First of all, let me thank you for your initiative. It's quite commendable. I think there's a tendency among many Eritreans, both old and young, particularly in the diaspora, that we tend to be talking a lot and reading much less. And establishing this book reading club is a very important step in reversing that tendency. And I think it'll be very useful in terms of educating Eritreans and enabling them to become more aware of themselves as Eritreans, of their history, and of the present situation at home. Well, I think the introduction in the book says a lot about me. Let me just briefly say that I had a very varied experience, even in terms of education. Even when if I want to start from high school, I started in Asmara, 9th grade. Then I went to Harar in Ethiopia. And then from there, I went to the Bay Area in the San Francisco area on the other side of Berkeley. From there, I went back to the university in Addis Ababa for 1 year. And then I went back to the University of Colorado and went back, taught for 3 years at the university in Addis Ababa. And then I went back to Harvard for my PhD. And all that. During that time, that was, of course, a very interesting period in modern history. There you had the Afro-American struggle for civil rights. You had the national liberation movement in the third world, the most prominent of which was Vietnam. And then we had the workers' movement in the industrialized West. And they had the socialist camp, which was at the time headed by the Soviet Union. So you had this notion of a first world, second world, third world, and we saw ourselves as members of the third world and part of the really national liberation movement, the struggle for decolonization, the struggle for self-determination, the struggle of peoples to get out of colonial oppression, of being subjected to alien exploitation, and determining their future. And we're very actively engaged with the liberation movement in Africa, the ANC in South Africa, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, PIGC in Guinea-Bissau and Capo Verde. And we were, of course, hosting people like Amilcar Cabral at the time when we were students. And then we established this Eritreans for Liberation in North America, of which I became a chairman, etc. We started linking up with the liberation movement inside Eritrea. At that time, of course, we had this checkered history of a civil war that went off and on for about 10 years. And we identified at the Eritreans for Liberation in North America, we identified with the EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Forces at the time, which later became Eritrean People's Liberation Front. And we started supporting it in a very significant way, logistically, financially, materially, and also in terms of joining it, grooming cadres and sending them, in the first place, giving them training in the US and sending them to serve in the field. So I was part of that generation that was deeply involved with not just with the Eritrean struggle for self-determination, but with the overall progressive movement in the world, the socialist camp, the workers' movement, and the national liberation movement in the then so-called Third World, which is now generally known as the Global South. And of course, I joined the liberation movement, and well, we had a very difficult, hard struggle. I think the record shows that we won against overwhelming odds. And essentially, we fought for freedom, for justice, for democracy, for prosperity. Gradually, post-independence, we ended up with the exact opposite of this. We saw the rise of a dictatorship, the clamping down of basic freedoms, and the incarceration of people without due process, their indefinite detention, the closure of the private press, or not so free, but private press, etc. In general, the aims, objectives, the vision which we fought for, which we encapsulated in our National Democratic Program, which was adopted in the first Congress in the beginning of 1977. We had these objectives that were very clear. We wanted for an independent Eritrea to be part of the progressive world, to have a developmental state, a society characterized by harmony, inclusiveness, and also seeking prosperity for all. And let me say that initially I wanted to write about self-reliance, our experience of self-reliance during the war, because essentially we had no external support. Of course, we had a lot of popular support at the people level, at the civil society level, particularly in the West, in Europe, in the United States, in Canada. But at the official level, we had no support, and therefore we had to rely on ourselves and on our people. Self-reliance for us meant relying primarily on mobilizing your own people, their resources, to conduct the armed struggle. And we armed ourselves from the enemy, essentially the enemy's camps or the enemy's military stations were really our supply depots. We'll encircle the enemy and we'll capture all the weapons and etc.
I want to interject real quick, if you don't mind.
No, but let me finish this one. Just one minute. So what I had in mind was how we could replicate our experience of self-reliance as a world historic phenomenon into the reconstruction of the country, the development of the country. But when the country started going in the wrong direction, I abandoned that idea and decided to write Eritrea at a Crossroads. And the main objective was to familiarize, to add to the body of knowledge about Eritrea and its people, the evolution, the struggle, the aspirations, and the predicament in which they find themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You talk about like observing a sort of like the gradual transformation of, of all these ideals that the EPLF had initially espoused into the current regime. At what point in your experience did it sort of click in your mind that this is not going to be what I thought it was going to be?
It's a very interesting question. It's not really at a particular point. It's the evolution of a situation evolving into a critical stage. Initially, after independence, I was assigned to the university. I was the president of the university. We had no university to establish it, to revitalize it. We had a symposium, an international symposium of practitioners, scholars, etc., to restructure the university, revise its syllabus, etc., to actually transform it into a center of higher learning and development-oriented research to contribute into the development project of the country. The underlying premise was Eritrea's most important resource was its people. Therefore, human resource development was a key to Eritrea's development. So that's one thing. Secondly, we devised 3 instruments for nation building, state construction, and sustainable development. And these instruments were, first, the macroeconomic policy framework, which envisaged to transform Eritrea into an advanced, industrialized, and internationally competitive economy within 2 decades. We're inspired by the experience of Singapore at the time, and we thought this was feasible. So we had the macroeconomic policy framework, in whose drawing up I was instrumental as the then governor of the central bank. And then we had the national charter, which envisaged a democratic, harmonious, peaceful, prosperous Eritrea. And then we had the constitution to establish the rule of law. The most fundamental of these instruments was the constitution to establish rule of law in Eritrea. In Eritrea, you have customary laws which govern the people or administered the daily lives of the people for really centuries. Therefore, the Eritrean people are essentially a law-abiding, law-respecting people. And the constitution was supposed to embody the best in Eritrea's tradition, incorporate them with new ideas that were, of course, very much current in the world. The constitution was very important in the sense that it defines the structure of the government in terms of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, and established built-in checks and balances, with each having its own defined mandate or authority. And then it safeguards the fundamental rights and liberties of the Eritrean people. It also states the obligations of citizenship, etc., etc. So the constitution was a fundamental instrument for nation building, for the exercise of power based on the rule of law, to ensure the built-in balances, the rights and freedoms of the people, and also equality of citizens before the law, etc., etc. And while we started on the journey with these instruments, the third Congress of the EPLF, which produced the PFDJ, was a turning point. In the sense that, as I state in my book, it represented a coup against the objectives, the vision, and the program of the EPLF that we followed during the war, that allowed us successfully wage the war to total victory. And we were quite confident that it will guide our journey for the reconstruction and development of the country. So in the third Congress, the traditional or the some of the most prominent leaders of the liberation movement of the EPLF during the war were sidelined, and new ones who had no such experience, some of them had really no experience in the field at all, were brought to the leadership, essentially to make it possible to rule without any resistance, without any opposition. So the outcome of the Congress, which transformed or which replaced the EPLF, Eritrean People's Liberation Front, by the PFDJ, People's Front for Democracy and Justice, which essentially is a misnomer, represented a turning point. But even within that, we thought we could pursue the objective because the Congress adopted the national charter. The macroeconomic policy framework was adopted prior to the Congress, and the Constitution was ratified in 1997. The drafting process or the Constitution-making process started in 1993, immediately after the declaration of formal independence, and then it was duly ratified by a constituent assembly that was quite representative. There was the Central Committee of the EPLF. There were representatives of the regions, the representatives of the diaspora, and many prominent leaders of the former ELF, Eritrean Liberation Front. Also, the Constituent Assembly was quite representative. So we thought that we had these essential instruments to rebuild the country, construct a developmental state, and develop the economy and bring about prosperity in the context of rule of law and justice for the Eritrean people. But again, the constitution was not implemented. The national charter and the macroeconomic policy framework were really abandoned. And the result is the concentration of power in one branch of the government, the executive branch, essentially in the presidency. The sidelining, in fact, not only the sidelining, but the suspension of the National Assembly, which is the legislative branch of the government, in 2001. And essentially the emasculation of the judiciary through executive interference. All these things led to the Eritrea that we have today.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take this opportunity to say, for those of you in the audience, like if you want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function and I will give you the mic. You mentioned in your response that, the Third Congress essentially represented like it was a coup. And in the book you write, and I'm going to read a passage, Isaias alleged that his fellow colleagues in the party Central Committee and Front Politburo have become too decadent and unfit to retain their positions of leadership. And then you go on to write, although some cadres tried to force debate on the issue, I found it quite perplexing that none of the accused challenged his accusations. Had they stood up to refute and counter his allegations, they would have garnered the necessary support, including the authors, to foil his coup. In that moment, like what do you think prevented them from countering those allegations? Like was there a sense already at that time that you can't really, there's no room for dissent, there's no room for debate, and it's best to just keep quiet? What do you think held them back?
You have to look into the structure of the EPLF at the time. The EPLF is the front, which incorporates everybody. And then there were initially the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party, which was transformed during the Second Congress in 1987 into the Eritrean Socialist Party. The structure of the TPS, essentially what we had was two parallel structures, an organization within an organization. And the majority, or virtually all, of the members of the Politburo were members of the Central Committee of the party, not the front.
Mm-hmm.
As members of the Central Committee of the party, they were members of the Politburo of the front. And so the modus operandi was such that all important matters are first decided at the level of the party and then brought over to the level of the front. So my presumption was that this was discussed and settled at the level of the party. Mm. And that's my sense was that they kept quiet because they had really worked this out within the party. That was the modus operandi during the war and until the dissolution of the formal dissolution of the party at that time. And therefore, most of the leading cadres of the front, like myself, were members of the Central Committee of the front, not the party. So the party was, you had this notion of the party as the vanguard party, leading the alliance of workers and peasants for a successful national democratic revolution. And therefore, we followed that modus operandi. And I suspect it continued to operate until its dissolution. So most people kept silent because we felt, at least me and some of the people I discussed it with, felt that this must have been hashed out within the party, and therefore it was a done deal, and that's why they kept quiet. That was my understanding. Now I understand. In the first place, I never condemned the journalists. At the time, I can say this, but there is an issue that I like to keep for a later date that I will discuss in a second book or in a second edition of the book, because it hinges on national security, and therefore I will say it when I think the time is right for it. But essentially, there was a mistake was made. But that's not the only reason. When I was as ambassador, when you're in diplomatic service, you cannot criticize the government you're serving. You must do whatever you're instructed to do. If you want to say no, if you want to criticize, you have to resign, as I did later. Otherwise, under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Protocol, a representative of a state duly accredited and as an ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary representing the state of Eritrea, I could discuss issues internally within my colleagues or in the government, but I cannot openly criticize or oppose a position of the government. And therefore, that was the major consideration. But the journalists, I never said any negative thing about them, because I know I was a member of a select parliamentary committee of the National Assembly. I think we were about 7 of us who were tasked with looking into the case of the jailed journalists. And our finding, which was unanimous, was that the journalists did nothing wrong. They were doing their job. They should be released forthwith, and that the private press should be allowed to function. So make a difference. And so there are 2 reasons. The one I said, of course, that I had some reservations about some of the things that were done. But the most important factor is, as ambassador representing the state of Eritrea, I could not criticize or disobey. If I disobey instructions, so I was under instructions to state that if I wanted to oppose that, or if I want to criticize, I had to resign and leave service, serving the country or the state. And the second one is Look, one of the problems, I can say this to you. If you look at the composition of the Central Committee of the PFDJ, of which I was a member, the majority are either in exile, dead, or in prison. Why? Because they started to demand for dialogue, for meetings, to discuss issues of paramount national interest, paramount national concern. And what happened to them? Despite their parliamentary immunity as members of the National Assembly, they were arbitrarily jailed. They have not been brought to a court of law. They have not been formally charged, except via declarations in the press. And therefore, the avenue for internal reform, the avenue for internal renewal from within the PFDJ was closer to them. And these are some of the most prominent members of the leadership, of the historical leadership of the EPLF, and ministers of the post-independence government. If these people cannot bring about productive engagement in dialogue, how can individuals here bring about meaningful dialogue within the PFDJ? Look what has happened in Eritrea after 30 years. What if you want to brand Eritrea? What brand fits Eritrea? Eritrea post-independence. You can talk about certain aspects. Eritrea producer per capita of the largest number of refugees. Why? If those who claim to be supporting the government think that things are okay in Eritrea, why are they outside? After 30 years in Eritrea, in my introduction, I said that we had actually envisaged to develop Eritrea into an industrialized, technologically advanced, internationally competitive economy within 20 years. 30 years plus now. The state cannot provide the basic needs of everyday life. No electricity, no water, no food. You have a coupon economy, controlling people through the rationing of coupons, controlling what they eat, what they drink. Okay? Political and economic space completely closed, the country isolated. Eritrea is endowed with considerable resources. It's human resource and enterprising people and industrious people. The only university was closed in 2006. Why? So that it cannot produce educated and skilled manpower. The macroeconomic policy framework has been abandoned. The constitution has been relegated to collect dust. The national charter has been set aside. All these instruments. And therefore, change must come from within Eritrea, supported by democratic patriotic forces outside Eritrea. I am not in support of change coming through external forces. I think change should come through the agency of the Eritrean people from within to ensure a stable transition to a democratic system of government. Otherwise, the stock shops, these social media outlets that are being financed by the PFDJ, some of which are really substandard and you kind of cringe when you listen to some of their presentations. Instead of wasting money on the social media outlets, the government would have been better advised to use this money to produce electricity, to bring water to the households in Eritrea, and to really open up the political and economic space so that people can work, people can farm freely, can invest in their own country, can make a living. Why are Eritreans everywhere, like in Juba, in Kampala, in Luanda, in Nairobi, and they've made it quite well. I mean, I travel very often for work to these countries, and it's a source of profound agony to me that these Eritreans have been denied the right to work, invest in their own country, and are investing in these countries and succeeding and contributing to the development of these countries, while their contribution is badly or sorely needed in Eritrea. So I think people are free to engage, disengage, to say whatever they want, but I see very little change coming from PFDJ supporters from outside. Even the most prominent leaders of the liberation movement inside Eritrea, who are members of the leadership, who are some of the most important ministers in the country, were unable to make a dent in this regard. I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, sorry. It was bound to happen today at least once. But what do you think about, I know, Ephraim, you have a question about like the engagement in the diaspora, which I think is really interesting. We'll get to that in a second. But what do you think about the different, I don't even know if I can call them like opposition movements, because I don't know that there's I don't see like a structure anywhere. But what do you think about attempts to create, dialogue in opposition movements? Like, is there anything that you see happening outside of the country in the diaspora that you approve of, or that you think can bring some kind of change within the country? Because when I look at, and fresh in my mind right now is the protests, the Brigade Nahamadu protests, and I see that, and I don't see how that's going to affect any long-term positive change. So I look at the landscape, the opposition movement landscape, and I don't feel inspired by anything. And I just want to know what you think about that.
If you look at the Eritrean diaspora, it's a very important component of Eritrean society, particularly with its very strong links to Eritrea, family links, and its commitment to the country. Of course, it grew up in different waves for different reasons, or because of different causes. In general, what you see in the diaspora is division, not only division, but polarization, fragmentation. And the involvement of external forces, or the fact that many in the diaspora has allowed for external interference, could be part of the reason. In terms of dialogue, I think in 2013, we started what we called the Forum for National Dialogue, and I was a member of that. And we tried to organize inclusive forums for dialogue, to exchange views, to come up with a common understanding of the situation in Eritrea, bring about a common vision about the kind of Eritrea we'd like to see in the future, and based on that, to work out a program for change, at least a program that we can all agree with. These organizations can retain the independence of the individual organizations, but at least within their own respective organization work towards a common objective. And I think in 2014 or 15, I don't remember, we had such a meeting in Nairobi, and most of them were represented, some of them were not represented. So we set up an ad hoc committee to organize within 6 months an all-inclusive forum like that, to bring about those who were absent, including those who were present, etc. The ad hoc committee started to work, but within a few months it was disbanded. Mm-hmm. And the ad hoc committee was representative of all trends and groups and of the so-called opposition in the diaspora. And it happened that I asked one of the people who was responsible for the disruption of the process, mm-hmm. and it was a quite frank in discussion, and he said, look, because many of them were also based in Addis Ababa. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, upon our return to Addis Ababa, we're called by one of the Ethiopian government, or at the time TPLF security people, who was responsible for the Eritrean diaspora organizations, said, if you don't undo what you've just done in Nairobi, mm-hmm. we'll expel you from here, will not pay your stipends, will not pay your rent, etc. They said we had no option, but so external interference is a factor. Historical baggage, I refer to a long civil war, 10 years civil war. That also has its own impact on the outlook of many in the diaspora. We've not really overcome the baggage of that historical experience. After that, we tried a few times. We didn't succeed. Following, I kind of made an assessment, an appraisal of what could be done. And then I established this Eri-Platform. Actually, Eri-Platform was established prior to that in 2013 as a civil society platform to provide inclusive dialogue for Eritreans and really help them make an effective contribution to change and democratic transition in Eritrea. We've been doing that, and I think we've had about 7 symposiums, most of them held, some in Frankfurt, Brussels, Washington, etc. But when you assess the experience in terms of cost benefit, I cannot say that it's been very successful, because every time an issue comes, like in the last case, the war in Ethiopia, particularly the war in Tigray, a lot of people, that happened to be a very divisive factor. Many of them started with Tigray Ta'uwet, others. What I tried to do through Eri-Platform, or through the platform that I organized, was really implore Eritreans in the diaspora to make a distinction between the state of Eritrea, to which all of us belong, the people of Eritrea, of whom we are members, and the government of Eritrea, which oppresses us all. But for many, discontent with the government, distaste for the government, hatred of the government, kind of leaks or transforms also into discontent or into hatred of the state and the people. In other words, the inability to distinguish between the interest of the government and the interest of the people and the state of Eritrea has been a core problem for the diaspora. Because failing to make that distinction many have fallen into the trap of opposing the government and at the same time not paying attention to the interests of the people and the state of Eritrea. So that has been one of the factors of division. But I still think that the diaspora, which is very important in terms of the relative number of educated people, people with financial resources at their disposal, people with opportunities for education wherever they are in the West or even in Africa, etc., because the well-to-do are enabling their children to go to some of the best schools. So it's better resourced, better educated, better skilled, and therefore it can make a very significant contribution towards change and stable democratic transition in Eritrea, provided that it gets act together. Mm-hmm. It orients itself mm-hmm. towards this objective of course, trying to weaken and isolate the government, the regime, and strengthen the interests of the people and the state of Eritrea. And also, they can support and encourage. There is resistance inside Eritrea. There is no question about that. Otherwise, there will not be so many of these people being frozen, suspended from work, jailed without due process, and disappearing, and never being heard of once they're gone. So all of that is an indication that there is resistance. Of course, it's illegal. If you're suspected, that suspicion is enough to land you in jail. Mm-hmm. But take it from me, there is resistance inside Eritrea, and a diaspora that finds its way, that gets its act together, makes a distinction between the interests of the regime, the interests of the state, and the people, can make a very significant contribution by encouraging, supporting the internal resistance to the point that once there is a critical mass is reached, then that will trigger change. And once change comes, again, the diaspora can use its education, its familiarity with technology, with science, etc., their skills to help kickstart the development of the country. So they can contribute towards democratic transition, but beyond democratic transition, they can make a very significant contribution to nation building, state construction, and sustainable development of Eritrea.
Thank you for that. Before I ask my next question, Ephraim, I know that you had a question that you wanted to ask the ambassador that you mentioned at the very beginning of the meeting. So I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thank you, Hermona. Hi, Mr. Andebrhan, Ambassador Andebrhan. It's really nice seeing you again. Yeah, so I think you asked like all the questions that I had before, and you also mentioned or like explained some of them, but I just want to follow up and ask a couple of questions from what you were trying to explain to us. So one thing that has been like a hot topic that is being discussed nowadays is like the distinction that you were mentioning. So my question will lead into you also mentioned that there is a concentration of power in the presidency. That is obvious to everyone, right? So do you think that what we have now is related to mismanagement of the government, or do you think it's an intentional act that is aimed to dismantle or like to degrade what Eritrea has? So I want to hear from you like what you think. I want to hear like what you think about that, and I also want to listen why it is such way. Do you think if it is like a mismanagement? I think it's pretty obvious, or if it is like an intentional act, I want to hear more about it. And my second question is also, you mentioned that you were part of the diaspora who helped like galvanize the movement back in the days from the US as a diaspora. So you mentioned you were doing activities economically, financially, logistic-wise, and also grooming cadres. So why are we not doing such things? Why are we trying to reinvent the wheel? Is there a need to focus like more in the future while we are going in negative direction? Like most of the discussions that I see are concentrated either far fetched to the back or to the front. We are not talking about the present. So I want to know, like, why are we not able to at least utilize what we're being done, because that has worked. So I want to know, like, even you mentioned something related that was happening in Nairobi. So I want to know, like, what action items are being done other than like the discussions and the plans. I have also participated in the symposium, which are very nice and futuristic and very hopeful. But I just want to take this moment to ask you those questions. Thank you.
I will try to respond to your first question in brief general terms. Look, many in the government, including the president himself, we all shared, at least I believed at the time, the value enunciated in our national democratic program. And post-independence, in the national charter, the macroeconomic policy framework, and the constitution. For reasons that I alluded to before, what happened is the gradual concentration of power. And as Lord Acton famously stated, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So I think the mismanagement that we see, that we've experienced for the last over 3 decades, is a consequence of the monopolization of power and of the corrupting influence of power itself. Coming to your second question, we're trying to do that. In fact, I had the pleasure of meeting in one of the symposiums held in Washington. I remember we had a brief conversation, if you remember that. Yes. We're trying to do that. But again, the divisions, the polarization, and the fragmentation in the diaspora is not there just of its own accord. It's been brought into being by systematic work from 2 sides. One from internal, from within Eritrea, the other from externally, those who were essentially working against Eritrea, but did not want to any change, because the government in Eritrea, in their view, was doing the job of weakening Eritrea, and therefore really objectively aligning with them. So every attempt at constructive work has been disrupted just after it starts. It's been nipped in the bud. I can give you many instances. But the problem is the lack of a critical mass of people in the diaspora who are willing to overcome the historical baggage, resist the ease of external intervention, which comes with, of course, with some perks, And there may be the situation in the diaspora for many people who may not be self-reliant in terms of living, etc. That's also an enticement. So is the lack, it's people in the diaspora themselves, organizations in the diaspora, which invite external intervention or which could be penetrated by security or intelligence agencies of the regime and forces allied to the regime objectively, not necessarily working together, but even while working at each other, they could be allied in terms of this objective. So I think the problem lies in the diaspora, basically, that is unable to really assess the situation independently and work out some kind of collaboration, some kind of coordination, some kind of coalitions in support of rule of law in Eritrea. For instance, the issue of the implementation of the constitution is a fundamental issue for the implementation of the rule of law in Eritrea. But people disagree. Some of them say it's I mean, you know the debate. I don't want to go into that. So many of them say, no, this is our constitution. It's not our constitution. The Constitution Commission, its executive body, etc. I can send you the material if you want. I think it was one of the most representative democratic exercises in the modern history of Eritrea. I can vouch for that, okay? And a constitution is not a dead instrument. It's a living instrument that can be amended, improved, corrected, and there is a mechanism for its amendment within itself. So even on such a benign issue as advocating for the rule of law in Eritrea, people don't agree. Some of them want to bring the 1952 constitution that was drafted by Anzo Matenzo and 4 lawyers, British, Swiss, American, and French. Okay, some of them want a mix of the two, a synthesis of the two. Look, the 1950 constitution was the constitution of an autonomous Eritrea under the sovereignty of the Ethiopian crown. The present constitution, the constitution of an independent sovereign Eritrean state. People don't even recognize this fundamental difference between the two documents without going into their contents at all. So I think the fault lies in the history of division, in the history of fragmentation of the diaspora. And nowadays, unfortunately, when you, like Ephraim, come up with an idea, instead of assessing, looking at your idea, assessing your idea, and maybe validating it, or maybe criticizing with a view to improving it, they will look at you. Who said that? Oh, Ephraim. Ephraim, no. Just by focusing on you instead of your idea, that becomes an impediment to working together. The origin of an idea does not matter. Its utility matters. Its validity matters. Its ability to coalesce people around it matters. So some of the problems are attitudes like this, which are quite widespread in the diaspora. And some also say, okay, we want to establish a government in exile. This was fashionable, I think, a year ago or something. When you want to establish a government in exile or a body, a council outside, what does it mean? You're posing yourself as a substitute for the forces of change inside Eritrea. In Eritrea, there are the Eritrean people, there is a civil service, there is an army, there is a government, although it's dysfunctional. Because we all know that there are no well-functioning institutions. There are no institutions to speak of, really, because of the concentration of power, as I stated. But change must recognize the agency of the Eritrean people. And the interplay of the agency of the Eritrean people, when I take of the agency of the Eritrean people, also the people inside and outside. It is a collaborative process. During the change, the diaspora, again, if it can get its act together, can contribute by supporting, encouraging the forces of change inside and complementing their work and seeing itself not as a replacement, as a substitution, but as a complement. And of course, preparing itself for a role post-change. In a democratic Eritrea, it can play a very significant role, maybe as much as or even better than what it played during the armed struggle.
So I'm going to ask, I know we've probably been at this for a little over an hour now, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to anyone else in any one of our other participants to jump in and ask any questions they may have. I think some people are a little bit shy of showing their face because it's recording, but anyways, there will be some time at the end. So I'm going to just read a passage from the book, and then I'll ask my question because it ties in. So in chapter 2, you write, the first battle of Keren paved the way for Eritrea to serve as a strategic rear base of air and naval logistics for Allied operations against Rommel's German Africa Corps in the crucial battles of El Alamein and Tobruk until the German surrender in North Africa in May 1943. And then you go on to write, most of the casualties of the war for East Africa, mainly fought and principally decided in Keren, were Eritreans. Tens of thousands perished in combat or as collateral damage of Allied aerial and artillery bombardments. However, the epic battle was plotted, planned, and ultimately capitalized on in the capitals of Axis and Allied powers. Eritrea was merely a proxy location of the crucial campaign in the great fight between the forces of global fascism and liberal democracy on African soil. So my question is, as I was reading your book, as well as Berhane Abraha's Hagare Eritrea, one of the recurring questions that I would find myself asking is, what can freedom and liberation truly look like for a people who have constantly been treated as collateral damage in the never-ending perpetual tug of war between the big powers? So this isn't to say that the Eritrean people are just victims. They fought back. But you yourself, you write about the geopolitical calculus that rendered the well-being of this people as not only an afterthought, but something that isn't even considered in the equation. So how, what has to happen for this people, for the Eritrean people, to get out of the crosshairs of all these geopolitical considerations that render, like I said, their well-being as not just an afterthought, but something that doesn't even factor into the equation of these big powers?
That's a very, very important question, because it portrays the fact that Eritrea has been a victim of a geopolitical game in search of geopolitical interest, geoeconomic, geostrategic interests. Well, I think Eritreans took their destiny in their hands when they rose up in arms, the armed struggle. And quite frankly, when we won the war in 1991, I felt that I'll never see a war in Eritrea or in the region in my lifetime. I thought that was a war to end all war, I think, in Eritrea and at least in the neighborhood. The 1998-2000 war between Eritrea and Ethiopia came to me as a very rude surprise. I'll be very frank. Eritrea was established under colonial rule. As elsewhere in Africa, the colonial treaty borders are sacrosanct. And the African Union has adopted the principle of iti possidetis juris, which means respect or non-violability or inviolability of the borders inherited at the time of accession to independence. So neither the present government of Eritrea nor the former or present government of Ethiopia are responsible for the boundary. The boundary between Eritrea and Ethiopia is one of the most clearly demarcated boundaries anywhere in Africa. Because in the central sector, you have three rivers, which happen to be the historical divide between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And in the west, it follows the Merab River, but the intersection between two confluences in the northwest and southwest, northeast and southwest. In the east, 60 kilometers parallel to the coast. You cannot be clearer than that. So the boundary, the so-called border wall, was not really a border wall. There are forces within Ethiopia that have not accepted the idea of an independent, sovereign Eritrean state. I think they need to reconcile with this. Eritrea is independent, and independent Eritrea is here to stay. There is a lot of complementarity between the peoples of Eritrea and Ethiopia, particularly with our neighbors, Tigray and Eritrea. I think we should build on the complementarity or on this complementarity to work for the betterment of the human condition in both countries through cooperation, economic integration, free flow of goods, services, capital, investment, etc. The war served nobody's interest. War, I can tell you, I've lived in war, I've seen war, I've been part of it for 2 decades. It's legalized mass murder and legalized mass destruction. War is to be avoided at all costs. We justified the resistance in terms of a just war of self-defense, okay? So the border was unnecessary. And even now, it's not totally settled. Since in Africa, the colonial treaty border is sacrosanct, both Ethiopia and Eritrea and forces inside Ethiopia must accept this colonial treaty border is binding. Even the Boundary Commission decided its decision, its final and binding decision, applies only to sectors where the two governments do not agree. Otherwise, the demarcation directions of the Boundary Commission allow the two countries to agree on their common border. And what better than to agree to accept the colonial treaty border, to recognize the colonial treaty border, which then avoids people from changing nationality or changing administration from this or to that. People are saying, okay, these people belong to this, there. No, if both sides accept the colonial treaty border as sacrosanct, which is the principle and practice of the African Union, of the OAU, and then adopted by the African Union, I think this will bring about a definitive settlement of the boundary issue between Eritrea and Ethiopia and pave the way for cooperative, cordial relations between the two countries in the interest of their two peoples. Eritrea has resources, mineral resources, maritime resources, ports. Eritrea's ports would be more than enough to service everybody in the region. Eritrea can generate resources through them, and the countries can benefit through cost-effective port services and transit facilities, etc., etc. So I think that the border issue was a pretext, again, the geopolitical interests coming in to aggravate the situation instead of to try to calm it down and to bring about a resolution, etc., etc. So in the region, you have a matrix, a conflict matrix. National, we all know what's happening in Ethiopia, unfortunately. We all know what's happening in Sudan, what has happened in Somalia since 1991, the internal situation in Eritrea. All of that should come to an end, really. And for me, peace, stability, and prosperity are regionally indispensable. When there's war going on in Sudan, war going on in Ethiopia, there can be no peace, no prosperity, no development in Eritrea because of the spillover effect. So I think Ethiopians, whether at the national level or regional level, must accept the fact that Eritrea, an independent, sovereign Eritrean state, is here to stay. Respect its territorial integrity on the basis of the colonial treaty borders, which were agreed between Emperor Menelik of Abyssinia at the time and the Italian colonial authorities in Eritrea at the time. Okay, 1900, 1902, 1908. No need to modify to change that. Otherwise, when you try to modify that one or the other way, there would be an aggrieved party, and the aggrieved party would say, okay, now I am too weak, but when I get strength, I will recover, etc. The same situation like the case of Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany for many decades. So I think my prescription would be for both Ethiopia and Eritrea to accept, to recognize mutually the colonial treaty border, and based on the colonial treaty border, maybe to agree to demarcate it in due course with the support of the UN Cartographic Unit. And the UN has, of course, all the relevant treaties, relevant maps. It's in a position to facilitate at the technical level to help the two countries. Beyond that, then, the two countries should move towards cordial relations. We're neighbors. We're blessed to be neighbors. Being neighbors should be an asset, not a liability. What we need is statesmanship in both countries, good leadership in both countries, so this issue can be definitively resolved, and those two countries can move towards addressing the fundamental problems of poverty, underdevelopment, and of course, disease, all the known enemies of humankind everywhere.
Thank you so much for that response. So we're going on to about an hour and a half now, I believe. So I like, you guys know me, like I have like 10 more questions I could probably ask, but I also recognize that it's like Sunday afternoon, and many of you have somewhere to be, and I think it's quite late where the ambassador is at. So I'm going to open up the floor one more time and ask everyone, like, Ephraim, Daniel, and everyone who's been too shy to show their face, if you have any questions that you would like to ask the ambassador, now is the time to do so. Thank you so much to everybody who took the time to join us for this conversation. And oh wait, Johannes, you put your hand up. Take the mic. Your turn.
No. I was just looking for a reaction. It's all yours.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, then, my third time trying to wrap this up, I will say thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you so much to the ambassador for taking the time to come and answer our questions. I think I said this already at the very beginning of the meeting, but I really loved this book. I really, really appreciated it. I've read it like 3 times already, the third time being to prepare for this meeting, and I'm probably going to read it again. And I've been telling everybody in my family that they have to read it, and it's just a great work. And I thank you for writing it and putting it out there in the world for us in the diaspora especially. And once again, thank you for making the time to come meet with us today.
Well, I'm really very happy to have been part of this conversation this evening. I'm very grateful to you, to all of you, for joining the book reading club. I think it's a very important step. I commend you very highly. And I really would say, by way of closing, keep up the good work. And feel free to get in touch anytime for any issue, whether in the book or outside the book, on the prevailing situation in the region, in Eritrea, on the way forward, etc. So thank you very much again. And I wish you all the best. Have a nice Sunday afternoon.
Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.